Hi, good evening, friends. I welcome you all to our summer internship guest lecture series. Today, we have with us Mrs. Veena Krishnamurthy. She is an expert for French as well as for English. She used to teach in Alliance Française, and later she shifted her focus to IELTS training, and she is one of the certified trainers. Apart from that, she has been a very versatile linguist and done lots of experiments in life, including her venture called liveguru. Through liveguru, she has introduced online training programs for languages from Chennai, which she has been successfully running for last few years. Upon our request, she has kindly agreed to deliver a guest lecture on localization problems while doing consecutive interpretation in the context of tourism. So you might be knowing she has been hiring lots of people for cruise tourism. So she will share her problems about how tourist guides as well as interpreters face problems while explaining the locale or very regional, touch of culture or society or a language or a situation. Generally, interpreters do get along well, but at times they face huge cultural gap, linguistic gaps, and it becomes very difficult for them to handle. So today, Mrs. Veena Krishnamurthy will explain us how these problems are tackled and how her team handles those cross-cultural elements we called third space. There is nothing called yes or no, but there is also chances of, combination of yes and no. That is what is called third space. So when we are talking about literal interpretation, when we are talking about sense-to-sense interpretation, there is a possibility of combining both. We can make literal as well as sense-to-sense depending upon the situation. So while doing consecutive interpretation of this kind, it is not only language barrier that comes into picture. It is also the cultural barrier. It is also the situational barrier, and it is also the logistic barrier that comes into picture. So as an interpreter, the more quickly we adapt to, the more seamless interpretation we do for our tourists. Otherwise, if we get stuck up somewhere, they will find it very difficult to understand, and they may complain about your capabilities. So these challenges Veena will discuss, and let's see how it goes. Now I would like to invite Veena Krishnamurthy to please take over and continue with your lecture. So she will deliver a lecture first, and then we will have another question and answer session in which you will ask whatever number of questions you have. She will certainly like to clarify your doubts. I again welcome Veena to please.
Hi, good evening, everybody. First of all, thank you, Ravi Kumar, for that wonderful introduction. And it's wonderful to see so many faces here eager to know about the impact of interpretation and, especially in the tourism sector. So he's already told you about me. There are a couple of things that I would also like to share about myself. I have traveled a lot, so which means, I have come across different cultures and the impact one's style of speaking, one's style of communicating with the others can have on the other person. So there are a lot of things that are played at here, especially in the tourism industry. So the most important thing now is to understand why we are talking about multilingualism and interpretation. We have heard about bilingualism, but what is the impact of multilingualism and interpretation, especially in the tourism industry, and above all in the Indian context? I'm sure this is a problem that exists in many other contexts also, maybe in Europe and in other countries also, like in Africa. But here I'm taking up the situation of India. what exactly happens. So in my presentation today, I shall be discussing firstly the difference between a bilingual and a multilingual interpretation, and secondly about how it impacts quality of interpretation, and finally about the effect it has on the listener or the person who tourist. All right, so let's look at first what bilingual interpretation is. So by this, I'm actually referring to a context where the tour guide and the interpreter both come from the same linguistic background. So both speak the same language, and they are in a locale which is familiar to both of them. So which means they understand the place, they understand the kind of information that is going to be shared. And so when interpretation happens, they are sort of prepared for it. They know what exactly has to be shared. So there are no surprises here. Whereas when you look at the multilingual interpretation, it is something that throws up many, many obstacles and many challenges which are completely unexpected. So as Mr. Ravi Kumar was saying earlier, I was recently recruiting for a company which had about, I would say, almost 12 ships coming over 6 months. So I must have interviewed about 300 to 400 people for, for the job. So I interviewed Italian interpreters, German interpreters, Spanish, French, and then I also had to check their English and their understanding of, both the languages. But what completely took me by surprise was the fact that in this kind of interpretation, they also have to have a very good understanding of the place that they are going to and the language that is spoken in that particular region. This is very, very particular to India, because each region in India is different, and each dialect spoken there is again different. So there are many, many challenges that are thrown up because of this. So when we look at multilingual and bilingual, so we notice that multilingual throws up a lot more challenges. Okay? So let us look at the multilingual context. What are the different things that happen? What are the different kinds that we find here? So here, first of all, we are looking at a tour guide and an interpreter plus the visitor who is there. All right. So there are 3 people involved in this. So in the first instance, we have the tour guide and the interpreter, both of them from different linguistic backgrounds. So they have a lot of difference in their language. So for example, who speaks Hindi and somebody who speaks, let's say, Telugu. All right. So they both are from different languages, but the one common language that they have while interpreting is probably English. All right. So this is one scenario. The second scenario is where the tour guide and the interpreter are from different cultural backgrounds. They probably speak the same language, but culturally they are completely different. Right? So that also could happen where, probably one grew up in a different place and the other grew up in a different place, and they have different customs and traditions that they follow. And they are not very aware of what happens in the other place. So that is another situation. And a third situation is a tour guide who is from a different cultural background, whereas the interpreter is a local person. So the interpreter knows everything about the place, but the tour guide has come from a different place. So this is another challenge that happens here. And the fourth one is where the interpreter is from a different cultural background and the tour guide is local. So why are we talking about all these things? How does it impact, interpretation? So what happens is, when we look at the first case where the tour guide and the interpreter are from different linguistic backgrounds, there are problems while interpreting. The language is not very clear to the person, so the interpreter is not prepared for the different words that are used by the tour guide. So what happens is, when he passes on the message to the visitor, it might come out as something that is different from what was intended. Now, looking at the second one, where the tour guide and interpreter are from different cultural backgrounds. Now, if they are not aware of the culture that is being discussed, or if they are influenced by their own culture, what happens is, when they pass on a message to the visitor, to the foreigner who's in our country, the information that goes out is the wrong one. It's completely wrong. And what happens is, there are problems. If the visitor knows something about it, then he understands that there is something that is being said which is not correct. And the third one is where the tour guide is from a different cultural background and the interpreter is a local person. This can lead to a lot of problems, because if the tour guide is saying something that is not correct about the local place, whereas the interpreter knows that, this is not right and this is the correct information that has to be shared, then that could create a problem between the two of them, and this could impact their final output to the visitor and also the relationship between them. Sometimes they spend a lot of time. In this case, when I was talking about the case, these people were exposed to each other for almost 6 months. So it was very important that they create a very good rapport between the two of them, so that they continue to give a seamless interpretation in the best way possible. Now, the fourth one, where again the interpreter is from a different cultural background and the tour guide is a local person. The tour guide is trying to explain something about the place, but the interpreter has absolutely no idea about it. So what they do is they again pass on the wrong information, or they delete it. They don't bother to interpret that part at all. They just leave it out. So these are the main challenges that we faced. So let us look at what happens when a tourist faces these kinds of combination. Do they get all the information that they are supposed to get, or is this information error free, and is it completely accurate? More often than not, no, it's not accurate. So it hinders, as Mr. Ravi Kumar was saying, it hinders the smooth interpretation or the seamless interpretation. So the one problem that gets created here is the problem between the two of them, the tour guide and the interpreter. Now, the second thing is how the information is twisted and the wrong information goes out, when all of them know that this is not the right information, and there is only one person who doesn't know that it is incorrect information. So that can also create a problem. So this creates an impact on the visitor's mind, that this interpreter is probably not capable of delivering a correct message. Whereas the person might be very good with language, but because he doesn't have a good understanding of the tradition and customs and the culture, he is giving a wrong information. So that could again hinder, the interpreter's authenticity or his skills or his genuineness. Again, the problem could be with the tour guide, who is using sometimes words that are local. For example, in Malayalam, he might be talking about a particular word which is not familiar, but that comes naturally to him, and the tour guide might not have done enough research to say that in English. Now, this person comes from a different region. He speaks only English, doesn't speak the local language, so he doesn't know what it is. So he manages to say something which is absolutely not the right thing. There was one example where I was actually telling somebody about a place in Hyderabad, which is the area called Charminar. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the place. And there they have these lark bangles, which are very, very special. So there is a sort of paste-like thing that is created, and it is poured onto metal frames, and these beautiful bangles are made on which stones are embedded. Now, there was one interpreter who had no idea about what lac was, and she didn't have an idea about what they call bangles in that particular language. So she made do, and the final message that came out was a toe ring embedded with stones. So you can see sometimes how the message goes out the wrong way because of the language problems, and also because the person was not familiar with something that is called lac. Not just the vocabulary, maybe also that it is something that is contextually very specific to that area. Another situation which comes to mind is very often in the South, we all eat on a banana leaf, we eat with our hands. All right. So there are many people who don't understand that this is a part of our culture. They sometimes say, oh, they are not very rich people, that's why they eat with their hands. They can't afford a spoon. So that's a wrong message that goes out. That's because they are not familiar with our culture. It's not that they don't know how to interpret, but it's just that they are not familiar with what happens in that particular place. So there are many such situations that get distorted, and finally, when the message goes to the tourist, the information is wrong. And what happens to the interpreter? They lose their credibility. And it can be quite harrowing for the interpreter, because they are trying to say something and the tour guide knows that it is wrong, and the tourist knows it's wrong, and they're trying their level best and they just don't know what to do. So what do you do in this situation? How is it that one can cope as an interpreter? So some of the things that we did to help people, which sort of helped to a certain extent, not too much though. The first thing was to have a recce. So people went out to the place, actually did a round of interpreting there, looked at the place, mingled with the local crowd. Since we knew that this was a long-term project, they mingled with the localites and all that and tried to understand what exactly happens. But 1 week isn't much of, it isn't enough time for you to understand everything. And the second thing that we did was the people who came, who did the recce, they were kind enough to record everything and share their notes with the others. So that was another thing that really helped. So, creating a sort of data bank on probably your own experiences, not what is available online, because that could be something that is stereotype or that could be something very general. But, specific, how do I call it, experiences that you have as a person when you went out there. Those are things that are very, very important for an interpreter to understand. That is another way of dealing with this. And the third thing is, before you start interpretation, we advise the tour guide for some time, create a rapport with them, and also, sort of discuss and find what, or do they use a lot of local words, vernacular words. If yes, can I ask him if is he all right with my asking him questions on the spot? How do I manage this situation? So I think that was very, very important, that spending that little time with the tour guide and, getting both of them to relax and treat each other as friends and not as competitors, that helped quite a lot. And I think that was another thing that helped them to work on a seamless interpretation. But despite all that, we did have a lot of challenges, and that's one of the things that I shared with Mr. Ravi Kumar, telling him, we had a lot of these challenges, and it's, I think, high time we did something about it. So one very important thing that I have also noticed is there isn't much of training for interpretation in tourism. Tour guides are people who are certified, but most of the interpreters who come are either at the B2 level or a little lesser, and they adapt to the situation. So they think it is only about language and they do not have a formal training in interpretation. So I think it is time that we actually took cognizance of this fact and started working on it to be able to make the experience much more enriching for everybody around. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Veena.